Subscribe, or it will find you in your sleep.
This happened about 8 or so years ago, around Thanksgiving at my grandma's house. Everyone was asleep except for me. The only people in the house were my grandparents, my mother, brother, and I. No one else. I was on the computer because I couldn't sleep. I turned on a small TV to watch Adult Swim while I browsed the internet. At around 4:30, I started getting a chill up my spine, and I heard some children laughing. Distinctly the voices of a little boy and girl. I know I'm all by myself as far as being awake. So I turn and look at the TV, and it was in the middle of an Inuyasha fight sequence. So there was no way the laughter was coming from that. I checked the computer sound settings and everything was muted, so it wasn't that either. I sat there confused for a few moments while the giggles of the children were playing in the background. I figured maybe the radio in the kitchen was on. It was digital, so maybe it came on for some reason, or perhaps it had a timer. I got up and I kid you not, as I was walking to the door with each step, the laughter grew louder, from giggling to the forced to hard laughter. Once the gaffer started, I started to hear a baby cry as well. What's going through my mind is, what kind of radio show is this? And I just took 3 steps, nowhere near the door. I took a few more steps and the laughter turned hysterical, if not maniacal. The baby's cries turned to screams and wails as if it were in pain. And I was trembling and terrified from each step I took to the doorway. But my mind was on autopilot. I needed to get out of there and cross the hall to my mom, who would surely help me and notice the weird sounds too. The last couple of steps increased the laughter and crying to an almost deafening decibel. It was like I was at a concert and the speakers were directly in my ears. Blasting noise. It was painful and scared the shit out of me. I took all the courage I had, and as soon as I reached the doorway, I was going to sprint. I started to run, but then something shoved me and I felt these hands at my chest push me back into the room with enough force to throw me off balance. The crying and the laughter stopped as soon as I was back in the room. All of this happened within 20 to 30 seconds, but it felt more like 10 minutes. I was so scared. I cried and slept in the tiny armchair before my grandma came into the room and made me sleep in her bed downstairs. I am the youngest of 2 older brothers. My middle brother had passed away in 2005, and one of my cousins had given birth to a boy a few years later, so he's never seen or heard of my brother before. Fast forward a few years when the boy is old enough to talk around about 5. I guess my aunt was telling my mom that her son has an imaginary friend that he's been talking to called Michael. Now, both my aunt and mother play it off as kids will be kids sort of thing. That was until my aunt began explaining this imaginary friend and how I had some coincidental things that directly related to my brother. First, this Michael would wake up the boy at night wanting to play basketball. Kid didn't mind because he liked basketball too, but it was in the middle of the night. Secondly, Michael tells him he has an OWC and points to his throat. I'll get to that bit later. Then the trippy part comes when my mom went to visit my aunt. She was sitting on the couch watching TV while my cousin and her son walked in. Her son was hesitant at first and then walked back into his room. My cousin went to my mom and told her he was being shy, because he told me that is Michael's mom. I was then told if you show a photo of my brother, he points to it and says that's Michael. Even when I went to their house, the boy did the same thing. And this time, the cousin said that he whispered to me saying that's Michael's brother. Here's the kicker. My brother's name is Travis Michael. He liked to play basketball in high school, and he died from a freak accident at the San Luis Obispo sand dunes while riding an ATV. It shattered his Adam's apple and basically suffocated. My parents have both passed away. Their wishes were to be cremated, the ashes put in a nice box, and to be set on our wine rack. The wine rack has 3 shelves, and I was instructed to keep one shelf between the boxes. Well, my dad passed away in 2011, and my mother in 2015. It took me a few weeks to find a box to put my mom in. In that time, I kept her ashes in the same room, but a few feet away from the wine rack. Apparently, someone wasn't happy about this. Outside, we had a doorbell, and every single night at 3 a.m., it would begin ringing and wake me up. I took the button portion inside so nobody could push it. And still, it would ring at 3 a.m. I took the batteries out, and it still rang at the same time. I broke the whole thing apart, and it still rang. Our phone began to call itself and displayed my mother's name on the caller ID, even though the bill was in my name. My dad's guitars hung on the wall next to his wine rack, and the strings started breaking, one every few days. All of this stopped as soon as I got my mom a box and put her in there in the correct spot. None of this has happened since, and I have zero intention of moving these boxes. And if I ever were to find a new house, they would be transported together, with something acting as a divider between the two. A girl I knew for a few years and was very good friends with passed away in a car accident. A few days later, I have a dream that she is standing in the center of the road, and I am barreling towards her. I run into her, but then she appeared in the seat beside me. She forces my head towards her abdomen, where her stomach would be. There is a large mouth. The teeth are made of broken glass and sharp metal. She keeps saying, "Shh." I wake up from the dream, and I'm still hearing, "Shh." I look at the foot of my bed, and she is standing in my room. She walks through my door and into the hallway. I open the door and follow her. She walks down the hallway and vanishes through the front door of the house. I didn't realize at the time, but my dad was on the couch, and he asked me if I was okay, and asked if the flickering lights are what woke me up. He didn't see her, and I never noticed the lights flickering. I have a lot of stories. The first one I'm going to share is from when I went to a field trip. So I grew up in Northern Virginia, and we had plenty of battlefields and such to visit for school field trips. In 5th grade, my class went to the Belle Grove Plantation, which was at Cedar Creek Battlefield. Cool house, still has damage to her columns from gunfire from the battle. Anywho, my class was in the kitchen of the plantation, listening to the tour lady talk about whatever it is you tell a bunch of 10-year-olds about plantation life. There are these big double doors on each side of the room, and they are open. And then we hear a humming coming from outside. The teacher's aide, who I'll call Bulldog because she looked like one, told us that whoever was humming to knock it off. But that's the thing. It wasn't any of us, and it was coming from outside. Bulldog goes out the kitchen and comes back in and goes out to the side that leads to the garden. She comes back in and says to the tour lady that no one is out there, but she could hear the humming right there in the garden. Doesn't sound like much, right? Well, fast forward a few years, and I'm reading a book entitled The Ghosts of Virginia. And there's a story about Belle Grove in it. Apparently, the lady of the house was found in the smokehouse one day, badly beaten, half in the embers, with clear fist imprints on her face. She died just a few days later. A slave girl was accused of beating and murdering and was hanged for it. And the lady of the house liked to walk in the garden and was known to hum often. And various people over the years were witnesses, I guess you could say, to the ethereal humming that would just take place in the garden. That just thoroughly freaked me out when I realized that I witnessed it too. When I was 14, my father died. There's no need to be sad about it. He was an arse. When he was alive, he loved to sneak up on people and scare the crap out of them. One of the ways he'd do that was to just silently creep up and chill out in the corner of your vision until you realized there was this arsehole staring at you. After he passed away, I'd be sitting in the living room watching TV, and I would see him just glide up into the corner of my vision across the room and stand and stare at me from the front entryway. I'd look over and poof, nothing there. Now, this can easily be written off as me being tired or my mind playing tricks on me. Now, that isn't all of it. Dad loved to watch history and nature shows. And this was back when the History, Discovery, and A&E channels actually played decent documentaries on biographies and the like. He was an insomniac, so he'd always be up late with one of those channels on. And the walls were incredibly thin, and I'd always have to beg him to turn down the damn sound so that I could sleep when I was a kid. After he died, for a few months, at least once a week, I'd be in bed, and all of a sudden, hit the TV in the living room, and it would be a documentary on ants or a biography of Churchill and other things. It spooked me, definitely. My brother wasn't doing it because, for one, he's deaf. And if he were to watch TV, he'd mute it. And also, he has his own TV. My mom worked nights, and it always happened when she wasn't home. And at this point, my sister had been living on her own for quite some time. I'd get up to see what happened. Maybe the cat had turned the TV on. Yeah, but no. Max, the tuxedo, was usually in bed with me or outside, and I'd be able to hear the TV droning on about worker ants as I made my way down the hall, through the kitchen and dining room to the front entryway. And once I'd get to the spot where I could see the living room and the TV, all noise would cease. It would be dead silent. So quiet, in fact, you'd probably hear a spider fart. But wait, there's more. Off-street past, the locked, chained, and dead-bolted front door would open all the time on its own to let the cat in. This once happened in front of everyone at different points over the winter, after our dear old dad had kicked the bucket. But the thing that really got me is what I'm about to tell you. I was down in the basement one night watching TV. My mom was home and in the living room. Whenever she needed me, she'd stomp on the floor to get my attention. And that night, she stomped something furious. I raced upstairs and she's sitting in a chair with a wooden TV tray table in front of her. On the table was a styrofoam cup and it was shaking violently. There were no open windows. There were no fans. I picked up the cup and checked it for wires or strings. Absolutely nothing was attached to it. No way it could have moved by itself. I put it back on the table and it would shake again. My mother, of course, is saying that it had to be my dad and nothing else. The creepy visions, the cats coming through the bolted and chained front door, and the documentaries about ants being heard at all hours of the night freaked me out as much as that damn cup. I know my mom wasn't doing it. I checked and double-checked. The table was perfectly flat on the floor. It didn't wobble. And there was no way to make the cup move and not the table itself, you know. Now, my mom kept saying it had to be my dad. He was a trickster. So I just shouted out, "If that's you, Dad, knock it off." And it stopped. I didn't even finish saying it. And the cup had just stopped shaking. After the cup incident, the cat had to wait for a real-life human to open the door for him. I had no more documentaries in the middle of the night. And I didn't even see my dad creep up in the corner of my vision and stare at me. When I was 16, I started dating this guy, Joe. And he and his friends like to do the whole ghost hunting thing in abandoned properties. This was back before shows like Ghost Hunters made it to mainstream culture. There was one that they were very fond of, on a road not too far away from where we lived. When we talked about the house, we just call it by the name of the road it was on. But in the interest of trying to keep some anonymity, I'll keep that information to myself. So I'd only been dating Joe for a few weeks. And one weekend, he and I, along with 2 other friends, decided to mosey over to this house and check it out. Now, the story that everyone believed about this house was that this guy snapped one day, killed his brother in the barn, and then took an axe and went through the house and killed his wife and children. Inside the house on the 2nd floor, some walls did appear to have been chopped off with an axe. It's unclear why he did this. Some say his wife and brother were having an affair and that the kids were not really his. And just to get this out of the way, I did try and find the history of the place. But I never found anything to prove that any of it happened. But it's history. Well, I'm not sure if it had anything to do with the things that happened there. So anyway, we hang out and dick around and check the place out. Nothing happens. Boring, I know. But that night, long after I left, I dreamt that I was in the barn of the property. Our friend Anthony was with me, and there was this guy standing in front of me telling me I could ask him any questions I wanted and take pictures. But Anthony kept getting in the way and asking stupid shit. All I got from that dream was that this guy said he was a ghost. He liked to haunt the barn, and he was wearing a plaid flannel shirt with overalls, wearing a type of baseball hat, and he only had one arm. The next day when I see Joe, I tell him about it and describe what the ghost was wearing. And then Joe looks at me pretty hard and asks me if the ghost was missing an arm. What? Yeah, he was Joe. How did you know? Joe says that his sister would see a man exactly as I described, and missing an arm at night, hanging out in a hallway of their house when she was a kid, talking to a couple of other men. Apparently, Jolene would get up to use the bathroom at night, see these guys standing at the end of the hallway, and they'd be gone by the time she got to the bathroom. I hadn't met Jolene yet at this point, and years later, when she and I got talking one day, I asked her about it. And she confirmed that she used to see an armless man all the time as a kid. But wait, it gets a little bit weirder. Joe and I had another friend, Tina. Tina had a little boy, and they lived with her parents in another town, but also somewhat close to the plantation and axe murderer house. Her little boy would say there was a man in the basement of their house that kept talking to him. One day, he draws this guy. Guess what he draw? I have no idea if this thing was a ghost or what. But the fact that 3 different people saw him in some way years apart, but he always looked the same, genuinely creeped me out. The other story with that house, oh man. One night, total spur-of-the-moment decision, we decided to head up to the house. Because for one, we'd had enough people to cover all areas of the house and barn, and 2, one of us had a van, so we could take just one vehicle. We'd never had that many go at once. Because, well, when you do things like that, it's best not to have 4 cars parked at an abandoned house's driveway. So there were 8 of us at the time. 2 in the barn, 2 in the basement, 2 for the first floor and 2 for the second floor and 2 for the attic. At this point, I'd been to the house numerous times. I've been through the whole thing and know it as well as my own house. And I was not on drugs and had had nothing to drink. So Joe and I, we end up as the 2 who get to hang out on the second floor. Yet there's something I'd never seen before. This is going to sound so stupid, but I swear it's true. There was a bathroom there that had never been there before. I shit you not, I'd never seen this bathroom before. And it connected between 2 bedrooms. It was big, with a giant claw-footed tub. And it would be really hard to miss, you know? It freaked me to hell out. And everyone agreed that we'd hang on our assigned floor for at least 20 minutes. And Joe made us spend time in that bathroom. I was seriously wondering if it would fade out of existence with me in it. It didn't, thank God. But I went back there one last time to the house. I went in with friends that time, and not Joe. We went through the house again, and I kid you not, that bathroom was gone. I went through every doorway and every hole in the wall, and double-checked all closets. And that room was just gone, like it had never been there. I still don't know how to explain that. I really wish I had been drunk or high that night, but I simply wasn't. This is one of my grandma's stories that she used to tell of her aunts. They lived in Laos during the Secret War. Her aunt started talking with one of the American soldiers, and he started learning basic Hmong. After some time, though, he stopped showing up. The basic consensus was that he was dead, but she kept waiting for him. Once things got bad and the bombs started dropping, they fled to the caves for shelter. One night, as everyone is sleeping, she hears a familiar voice. It's the soldier. He's mumbling in a very broken Hmong, "I'm back for you," over and over again. Her eyes are still closed, until she feels something reach out and grab her shoulder and slowly move down to her hand. When she reaches her hand, she said it wasn't a human hand at all, but a large animal paw. She briefly opened her eyes to see a dark figure, clearly not human, standing over her. Then she heard her aunt get up. Something was said, but she couldn't make out what it was. The figure then left and my aunt followed. This was the middle of the night, mind you. The aunt was never seen again. The story is the dead soldier came back to take her with him, or something else imitated him in order to take her. I grew up in a mobile home. When I was very little, maybe 8, I made a friend that lived in the floor. His name was Adam, and he was my best friend for all that year. He wasn't there every day, and he was only there certain times of the day, usually right as I would get home from school. Adam always asked me how I was and what I did that day. Sometimes he would ask me to go to different places in the house so that he could hear me better. As it was usually in the bathroom, I would sit in the tub and talk to him. My brother could hear him too, but he lived with my grandparents and wasn't over often. Dad, I don't think, heard him, but Adam never talked when he was around. He wanted me to go outside a lot, and sometimes I did. But I never met Adam or saw him. Then, one day, Adam just stopped talking, and I never heard from him again. I'm not sure if it was a ghost or spirit of some kind. I hope it was. That'd be easier to swallow the truth than to live someone under my goddamn house, which is impossible, because it's all cement with no crawl spaces. My mom found an old picture with me, with one of my late uncles. She asked me if I remembered him. He passed away when I was really young, so I unfortunately didn't remember much of him. She told me that he used to take care of me while both my parents were at work, so we had gotten really close. He was essentially another father figure for me at the time. Supposedly, my parents were woken up one night by me crying and screaming his name. When they came into the room, they found me holding that picture of us, the one I mentioned earlier. They got a call from my aunt that morning that he had suddenly passed away. My mom said the only other times I've ever cried like that was when my dad had to leave for deployment. She's convinced that was my uncle saying goodbye to me that night. My great-grandmother watched my great-grandfather die. They were truly in love forever. After he died, she woke up every morning and said, "Damn it," because she was ready to pass away. Migrained aunts would hear her talking on a baby monitor. They set up talking to members of the family who had already passed away. Finally, one afternoon, they heard her go, "John, finally, why are you always so late?" They were frozen as John was my great-grandfather's name. They walked in 10 minutes later and she had passed away. She was just waiting for her husband to come and get her. In middle school, we took a trip up to Cataloochee Valley in Appalachian, North Carolina to look at some historical houses. We ate lunch across the river from Caldwell House, and a friend and I, Robert, finished early and walked across the bridge to check out the house. At the time, the house had not been refurbished, so there was a bunch of shit carved into the walls on the second floor. Since it was early winter in the mountains, there weren't many sounds, so Robert and I started walking on the creaky hardwood floors, and that was the only sound in the house. We were reading names, messages, declarations of love, and confessions off the walls and laughing when both of us stopped moving and talking at the same time and just stood quiet and listened as quiet and stilly as we could for something that we had both heard. After about half a minute, we laughed it off, figuring it was an animal. We were pretty spooked though, so we decided to leave the house, and we walked out of the room we were in, and wham! Our friend John slams his fist into the wall around the corner to scare us. Richard and I yelled at him for freaking out, and we were all laughing it off. John said that our teacher sent him to tell us that the class would be leaving in 5 minutes and to head back before then. We said, okay. John left, and knowing that it was him that we heard earlier, Richard and I went across the hall to the other upstairs room. A minute or two after we were in there, Richard noticed that there were carvings on the back of the door, so he closed it, and we were reading those when wham! Another slam, this time on the door. We jumped, stood there for a second, and then laughed before opening the door and headed back downstairs, figuring it was John coming to get us. We walked out of the front doorway of the house, and I saw John. He was across the river, and it had been maybe 30 seconds since the door had been hit. And there was no way he could have run down those stairs and across the yard and across the bridge. I pointed this out to Richard, and we ran as fast as we could and managed to get to the class. I've never been more afraid in my life. A few years later, my mother, who works in the medical field, was treating a woman in her late 90s or early hundreds who grew up in that house. Apparently, since town was so far away back in the early 1900s, the Caldwells weren't able to bring family members into town to a hospital or doctors if they were sick or old or going to die, and a good number of Caldwells died in that house. They were buried hardly a quarter of a mile away. I was on deployment to Iraq. A buddy and I were sitting in a guard tower in the middle of nowhere around 1 a.m. in the middle of June. And all of a sudden, we hear a bunch of dogs start losing their minds, barking, growling, howling from what seemed to be in every direction. Now, there are a bunch of Middle Eastern and Iraqi stories about dogs barking at night, meaning a demon is near. But we were grown men with weapons, explosives, and a radio. So we're good, right? No. A few seconds after the dogs start going off, an enormous gust of wind with a temperature that feels nearly Arctic hits us. Now our hair is standing on end. We were watching every direction with rifles drawn and trying to raise the other towers and talk on the radio. After numerous radio checks and nothing in return but static, we really began to kind of freak out. I asked my buddy Weeks to go check the TOC on foot and checks in to see what's going on. After much debate and heated discussions as to why, he's the guy that needs to go. He begins to walk towards the ladder down the tower, and he reaches down to the floor and lowers himself. Another gust of wind comes knocking down the ladder and completely blowing off the camo net on the top of the tower. So he's hanging on the floorboards, feet dangling about 20 feet off the ground in full kit. I lunge and grab him and finally get him up, and he probably weighs about 250 pounds in full gear. I frantically tried to raise anybody on the radio. And finally, we get hold of our TOC, explain the situation, and get us sit tight. There's something going on with the other towers. So we sit tight for what seems to be hours, but is more likely minutes. When the SOG, Sergeant of the Guard, comes out in a pickup and starts talking, it turns out nearly every other tower had experienced the same thing. And another guy that was walking from the makeshift chow shack to his cot got hit in the head with something and nearly knocked out. No one was around and nothing was found on the ground that hit him. So now we had a platoon of grown-ass men in a combat zone, all who've earned their combat infantryman's badge, pretty much shaking in their boots. To this day, we will still talk about it, and no one knows what it was. We asked our interpreter about Iraqi ghosts, and all he would say is, there are ghosts here, but I cannot say his name. Naturally, this sent us all into a fit. This was over 10 years ago in Iraq, in a very small outpost, and connection to the internet wasn't that great or reliable. So every effort we made to try and Google what it could be either failed or led to more stress-inducing stories and images. I still get chills. This isn't my ghost story, but my husband's. He lived in a rural town. There was a haunted hotel in the neighboring town, the Thomas House. We were closing on our house, and he flew into town to handle the closing. He checked into the Thomas House. My husband knew that it was supposed to be haunted, but he does not believe in ghosts. My opinion is not important. The ghost hunters had just been there. They did not see the reputed ghost, but the episode made for scary TV. It was Christmas. The home was decorated with antique and country Christmas delights. And the clown room. Yes, the clown room was in its full holiday splendor. Walking into his room, he passed a little girl in the hallway. She passed by without saying anything. He said, "Hi." The little girl then went into the doll room. He described her as being special needs, just his impression. He didn't see any guests during his visit. Only the family who owned the hotel was there. 1 year later, I went into my new hairdresser salon. She was a lovely local girl and had lived there for all her young life. And she knew the family. And we were talking about the hotel. When I told her about his visit and mentioned the little girl, she turned white. She then turned to the other stylist and said, "Did you hear that? There is no little girl living in that hotel. The family is now older and all the children are grow up." The little girl that Paul saw was the ghost. She plays in the door room, loves the clown room, and only appears to some people. Paul is the only person that does not believe he actually saw a ghost. There is a place called Meadowbrook Manor in Rochester Hills, Michigan, my hometown. It's on the campus of Oakland University, and it was owned by the Dodge family. And quite a few people have died there, including young. My buddy worked there for years, and my wife hosts events there. I even proposed to her on the property. The house is both beautiful, with stuff like secret staircases through bookshelves, but is also very creepy. There are a few known ghosts, including Caramel Apple Girl. The story is she is a very young, quiet ghost that lives in the house and holds a caramel apple with peanuts. Numerous people have claimed to see her, including my best friend, who was a no-bullshit guy who would never tell anyone. He was cleaning up at the end of an event, and there he saw a girl on the staircase eating a caramel apple. He asked her, "Are you okay?" And she said she was lost. My buddy said to hold on, and that he'd find her parents so that she could come down. He turned to grab a phone for a moment and turned around, and she wasn't there. He checked the stairs, and the peanuts were there. He and a few others roamed around the house looking for the girl. He called me over, and I drove over there real quick, because I thought this was awesome. After another 30 minutes of searching, we finally called the police and the employees locked the place up. When we were on the side of the house chatting with the university police officer, a light turned on one of the bedrooms and we immediately freaked out because that house had been searched for hours. My buddy looks at the two cops and they look at us and we're all figuring out who's going to do what. The cop starts to walk over, stops, looks at us and says, "Screw that," because he had heard the stories. He called in a bunch of backup before searching, and apparently there were no peanuts on the stairs when they went in. There's a bridge near where I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, that is notorious for screaming at people at night. The screams aren't audible to houses nearby, and supposedly you have to sit on the actual bridge to hear the scream at all. Though I personally haven't tested it or anything, the common explanation is that it's a bobcat that lives under the bridge, but people have checked with dogs and find nothing. While some friends and myself had all heard this story for years while growing up, but had never tested it. So one night, after a few beers, we get up the notion that we're going to test it. 5 drunk guys pile into a beat-up car and drive down and park on the bridge. It's 1:30 a.m. and it's dead silent out. We sat there for a good 45 minutes and nothing happened. We had the windows down and had started debating whether or not it was all bullshit. When the scream happened, we had the lights off, and it was a moon so you could see pretty well, and there for sure wasn't anything outside the car. But it was loud and sounded like a woman with particularly powerful lungs having her skin ripped off right outside the window of the rear passenger side that faced off the edge of the bridge. Now, I've heard bobcats in heat while hunting, and they do like to scream. It's hard to describe, but they do it in little repeating bursts. It was a good 3 to 4 seconds of extended screaming at incredible volume. We tore out of there like a demon was chasing us. A couple of miles down the road, we finally stopped and actually processed what happened. My adrenaline was going so badly that I was so scared and shaking uncontrollably. One of my friends had actually pissed himself, which I'd never seen anyone do. One of my friends immediately left the car and vomited. To give what I think was a good frame of reference to how actually terrifying this was, my friend, whose car we were in, wasn't even mad at the friend who pissed all over the seat. It was insane. To this day, I have no explanation for it. When I was a senior in high school, my mom and I went to the Glore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri. I knew nothing about it, except that my aunt wrote a paper on it for her psychology class, and it was supposed to be really interesting. The museum itself is a separate, newer building with the actual old hospital next door. The exhibit has a bunch of equipment and patients' belongings from when the psychiatric hospital was running in the early 1900s. So there were lots of creepy relics from the golden days of messed up therapy and questionable procedures. However, none of this really bothered me. Side note, the museum also has separate exhibits about Native American tribes local to the area and the Pony Express. We entered the main floor, nothing too interesting, just a gift shop and little displays. I felt fine until we reached the second floor where the psychiatric exhibit began. As soon as the doors opened, there was a figure. In my mind's eye, I didn't physically see the figure, and it kind of looked like a Death Eater from Harry Potter, only not big and without a head. It followed us around the floor, through the psychiatric exhibit, and eventually stopped. I told my mom to keep her feelings to herself, so I wouldn't have a biased experience. I looked at the items left behind by former patients, and I felt a presence telling me not to touch any of them, or something bad would happen. Finally, we made it to the Native American exhibit, and the figure was there again. It followed us, but stayed maybe 20 feet behind, stopping when we'd stopped. We took the elevator to the morgue area in the basement. You'd think I'd feel something. Nope, nothing. Finally, we went to the main floor and left. When we got home, I mentioned to my mom it felt like something was following us. She agreed and said she saw it too. I decided to do a test. I had us face away from each other and draw what we thought it looked like. Turns out, we drew the exact same thing. After that, I emailed the museum and told them what I experienced. I didn't think they'd reply, but they did. They told me what I experienced was actually a very common occurrence among their ghosts and staff, and they've all allowed investigations from time to time. So yeah, Glow Psychiatric Museum. I used to work as a cook in a tea room that used to be a brothel, back in the 1800s. We had the dining area and a little gift shop that sold different kinds of pottery and silverware. I would often be the last to leave and lock up, and would hear random sounds like footsteps or something, falling on the floor quite regularly, but was never fazed by it. One night, I was called in late to start prepping stuff for the Sunday brunch. So probably at around 10 to 11 p.m., I hear footsteps upstairs and hear the lights coming on. I knew I was the only one there at the time, so decided to investigate. I walk up the stairs and look around. Everything seemed normal, so I turned out the light and headed back downstairs when I see the lights come back on. I'm starting to get a bit freaked out, so I yell, "Hello?" with no response. I walk back upstairs to turn the light off, and as soon as I reach the switch, I see this large vase just sort of lift up and move to the right, then drop to the floor. Holy shit. I was so freaked out. I called my boss, and she casually brushed it off like, meh, it's regular here. I was helping my younger brother move into an apartment with his buddies, and had to bring my 2 very young daughters with me. My youngest at the time was about 2.5 or 3 and fearless. She went to every room with my brother, exploring and having a jolly old time until she got to the kitchen. Upon entering, my daughter froze. Her eyes were huge and fearful, and within 10 seconds she was screaming bloody murder and running for me as fast as she could, mumbling about the lady in the kitchen. My brother and I tried laughing it off, redirecting her and taking her mind off it, but my normally calm kid was hysterical, and we had to leave. She told me in bed that night the lady had red eyes and was so scary. If you know my daughter, you'd understand how unlike this it is. She was 100% convinced that she saw a lady just standing in the kitchen, and still to this day, 7 years later, she swears that she did. I don't believe in ghosts or what have you, but her reaction seriously made me question that. My brother also experienced some wacky stuff while living there. I remember that they'd hear noises, people walking around, and I think someone felt a ring tapping them awake one night. It's certainly fairly creepy. I used to live in a 1-bedroom apartment a number of years back. One night, I came home roughly at 2:30 in the morning and was exhausted, so I decided to go straight for bed. As I laid in bed trying to get comfortable enough to fall asleep, I heard a rather loud noise coming from the living room, kind of like what would happen if someone jumped off the couch and landed on the floor. I lived in an apartment building on the top floor, so I know it wasn't coming from below me. On edge now, I continued to lay there, listening for any further noise. Suddenly, whatever created the sound in the living room made a thundering dash towards my room. It didn't sound like a person running, more like something 4-legged. It was inhumanly fast, and the noise was deafeningly loud, until whatever it was stopped on a dime, which I assumed was about a foot away from my face. I refused to open my eyes, just on the off chance that something was there. The sound ceased, but there was an incredible feeling of dread and darkness that radiated throughout my room for approximately 5 minutes, but then it simply disappeared instantly and the area of the room returned to normal. It never happened again the entire time I lived there, but was certainly a wild experience. For a couple of years in high school, I worked at a donut shop in town. Old type place, they make the donuts fresh every night. All the workers there would talk about how the place was haunted by a former baker, big burly guy who eventually just slept in his carpet bag. My shift would start right before the restaurant/front closed, and before the bakers came in for the night, I'd be alone in the shop, the back where the baking would get done. And it would get absolutely disgusting. Jam and glaze all over the floor to the point I'd sweep up and have to scrape the floor with a paint scraper attached to a stick. I was an extremely lazy person and figured out I could just duct tape cardboard over the really bad areas and make my job way easier. No more jammed floors. Well, problem with that was that basically cut my shift in half. So I'd spend the time I'd normally be scraping off the jam off the floor at the front counter. One day I'm sitting there stealing time from the suite owners and I see some movement out in the corner of my eye. It looked like someone wearing a flannel, walking back from the front of the shop, then turning and running into the back again. I thought I'd just been caught milking the clock by the owner. I never heard any noise of anyone coming in, so I go to the back to check and face who caught me. No one's there. I know I saw someone. I walked upstairs to the offices, which I had never been into before. No one. I later asked what the ghost wore while he was alive. Always flannel. So I worked in a haunted daycare. My personal story happened while I worked with the 9 to 18-month babies. At nap time, they all sleep in their own cribs, and the teachers all huddle in the furthest corner, so the kids will stay asleep. One day, all the kids were asleep, which is a feat in itself. So I'm sitting facing the room at large, talking to my coworker. As I'm checking the room, a ball that was left out rolled across the floor, just straight up moved 4 feet across the floor. It didn't start anywhere near a baby, and even if it had, they were all asleep. The ball was slightly deflated, and it even sounded like someone tried to grab it. That sound of fingers trying to find purchase on rubber. Now normally I'd attribute this to a trick of the light, or the AC kicking on, But my coworker who'd been looking at me turned her head at the sound and said, "What was that?" I told her what I'd seen. We had a nervous chuckle, and we asked the ghost to kindly not wake any of the kids. Other coworkers had felt taps when no one is behind them. We've seen things move on their own, and one even saw something too tall and abstract to be a kid run down the hallways, only to disappear. I've had a few experiences that I can't explain at my current house. When my family and I moved in, I was around 7 years old, and I'm 20 now. I don't remember how soon after we moved in this happened, but I was laying in bed one night, just about to fully fall asleep. When I shit you not, something grabbed me by the ankles and pulled me a few inches down the bed. I didn't fall off the bed, but I sure as shit did not sleep that night. Another time, I probably would have been 13 to 14. I was playing Battlefield and fell asleep while the game was still going. I woke up at around 1 a.m., turned around to get my bearings, and in the kitchen doorway, about 20 feet from me, there was a tall, dark shadow, not a transparent figure. It was solid as night itself, standing tall, so tall, in fact, its head was crooked against the ceiling at a 90-degree angle. I froze for a moment and inspected it, making sure it was there. And it was. I stood up with the TV and Xbox still on to provide some semblance of light in the room so that I could turn on the stairway lights that led up to my room. When I went to turn off the Xbox, I looked back to see if it was still there. It was not. This one is a little more dismissible, if you so choose to dismiss it. But shortly after the last thing, I also was given a dream/nightmare/scarring experience by one of the spirits or whatever you want to call them in my house. I was on Reddit and on the front page, so I was looking through links that I thought were funny. I clicked a link that had a picture of a girl. I clicked the picture and immediately felt a knot in my stomach and saw that the thumbnail with the picture had changed to something entirely different, like a dog. I clicked the link below it in hopes that it would be normal, but I was wrong. My screen blacked out and just that picture opened on the screen. The words, "Daddy No," in bright red text started typing themselves on the screen. Quickly, and aiming to film my screen before it could, I woke up. On another occasion, I had a friend over, one with a connection to the occult, and they had their own experience. He saw a figure in the kitchen doorway, same as I saw, same time of night after the two of us had fallen asleep. I took that as solid confirmation that I'm not going insane. On another occasion, I was at a friend's house and we were in the basement playing video games and decided we wanted snacks. Now my friend had their own experiences in their house, so they said we should set up a camera in the basement to film while we were gone to see if, on the off chance, we would capture something. We set up a Mac with the webcam recording the couch where we were sitting. Upon returning to the basement to get back to the ever-important video games, we inspected the video to see what we captured. The video played for a minute or so before we both heard a voice at the exact same time saying, "Make it quick." Nothing was disturbed from the spot in the basement, as far as we could tell, so we didn't know what the thing had done so quickly. But rest assured, we had no plans to stay there that evening. With the amount of experiences I've had myself, I am either crazy to some degree or right to some degree. But these accounts are all true, at least for me. My good friend shared this story with me, and I've never been able to shake it or retell it as well as him. He is about 40 and divorced. Back when he was married with a 1-year-old daughter, him and his wife bought a house and moved in. It was apparently an old house that needed some fixing up, but they got a good deal and were ready for the work. After a week or so, he notices a life-size doll in the corner of the nursery where his daughter sleeps. It creeps him out because he's a normal human being, so he turns it around to face the corner so it isn't staring at him. After putting the kid to bed, he goes downstairs and asks his wife about it. "Where did we get that doll?" She looks at him and says, "I don't remember. I assumed someone gave it to you for our daughter and we moved it here." He's a little weirded out because he didn't remember moving the doll and wonders if maybe it was in the house when they moved in and he didn't notice it. The next morning, he goes to get the kid out of her crib and notices something. The doll isn't facing the corner anymore. It's looking at him again. I'm getting shivers already just remembering him telling me this. That's enough to creep anyone out. So he throws it in the closet and shuts the door. At night, he has an argument with his wife. I don't remember what it's about, and it's not really relevant. But the point is, they were getting into it a bit. They were loud and focused enough that they didn't notice their daughter crying upstairs. At a lull in the argument, his wife hears her. And says she's going to check on her. But he just tells her she'll be fine. Let's hash this out. Another minute goes by, and suddenly he realizes he's practically having to shout over the noise of his daughter screaming from her room. It sounds different. It's not a normal cry. He glances at his wife and quickly starts up the stairs. What he saw when he opened the door literally makes my eyes water with fear when I think about it. The closet door's open. The life-size doll is sitting next to the crib, motionless, and its arms are reaching through the bars towards his daughter, just stiff and motionless, like it was caught in the act before returning to adult state. Needless to say, the doll was thrown out and I believe burnt. There's no explanation other than something seriously demonic. This story of that house goes on for much longer though, and I always get shivers trying to remember it. We have some close family friends whose son died in an accident when he was 12. This kid was incredibly strong-willed and often mischievous, and he remained that way after he passed. He would often appear to his younger sister, who had been the one to find him after he died. His father was a violinist, and as he was playing for his memorial concert, she noticed him sitting on the edge of the stage. He then stood up, walked up to his dad, and plucked his violin string and broke it in the middle of the concert. The kid loved airsoft guns, and as a reminder that he was around, he would often leave airsoft pellets around the house for the family to find. You could wipe a counter clean, turn around and find a small pyramid of pellets on the counter when you looked again. Soon after he passed, my mom introduced a friend of hers to the family who started visiting the family weekly for a class the mother offered. When this friend was young, she used to see and talk to spirits, but hadn't had any experiences in years. After she started visiting them, he started appearing to her on the car rides home and have her pass on messages to his mother. She would come back and relay very personal memories that she couldn't have possibly known. This went on for a few months until one ride home, her infant started giggling and squealing for no reason. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw him playing with and I think tickling the baby. This freaked her out and she told him he had to go and he never came back again. The final, most profound thing he did was a year after he passed. On the day that should have been his bar mitzvah, which he had been preparing for, the family had a memorial that day. And when they got home, they noticed someone had left them a voice note when they were gone. They played it, and it was the song that was supposed to be played in his bar mitzvah, sung in these angelic, ethereal voices. They kept the voicemail for years and showed it to my family. And it was honestly one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. I've had quite a few stories from when my father passed as well. Some creepier, but this one is certainly my favorite. I was 13 and living in a small farming town. It was close to Halloween, so the change in seasons was in the air. My friend was staying the night with me, but by 10 p.m. we were bored and decided to walk to their house that was about 2 miles outside town. We reached the edge of town and the last street light illuminated the start of the empty country road that we had to walk alone. We didn't think twice about anything scary as it was mostly fields and tree lines, with the worst predator being the occasional coyote. We walked far enough down the road that the street light behind us was a distant oasis of light. It provided just barely enough illumination to remind us it wasn't all empty fields along the road. There was also a cemetery that ran for a short section beside this part of the road. My friend tried to jokingly say scary things, but their words echoed hollowly in the silence. Just as we reached the end of the cemetery and the tree line separated from the fields, we heard a noise. There was something in the trees and it was big. It was making a lot of noise, but it wasn't thrashing wildly. It seemed to be moving towards us slowly, but purposefully. The sound of the dead tree limbs breaking as it pushed past them sounded like explosions in the darkness. That was the first time in my life I understood a deer in the headlights. Even though my heart was hammering in my chest and adrenaline was being poured into my system, I was frozen. The primal part of my brain was screaming danger, but it wasn't providing me with any choices to pursue. It wasn't until a blur of movement crossed in front of me that my full mental faculties engaged. I was able to process the fact that movement was my friend running past me down the road as fast as he could. I decided that was a valid option and took off as fast as I could. We reached my friend's house safely and we spent the rest of the night theorizing what was in the trees. In the morning, I walked back down the road and past the cemetery. During the day, the eerie atmosphere was gone, and in the light of day, I was able to see one of the adjoining fields had a small herd of cattle. For the rest of my life, I have been 99% sure what we heard was a lone cow in the trees. It heard our voices and started coming towards us. But it's that little niggle of doubt, the not knowing for sure what it was, that causes me to lean towards a more supernatural explanation. My brother passed away on December 22nd at 4:40 a.m. in 2004. I've had a few things happen, like things flying off the shelves or hearing my guitar strings being plucked, but 2 years ago was probably the weirdest. 2 years ago, December 21st, I went to bed at 11 p.m. I usually keep my phone on silent, but I was woken up by my phone ringing in the middle of the night. I saw a number I did not recognize, and normally I answer anyway. But something felt off and I just couldn't. I couldn't explain the feeling, but I just felt like I shouldn't answer. The phone number left a voicemail, but I couldn't make anything out. I also noticed that they called the number on December 22nd at exactly 4:40 a.m. I tried to call them back in the morning, but when I called it said the number had been disconnected and could no longer be reached. I tried to look up the number everywhere and found nothing. I spent a year living in an overseas haunted dorm in Texas that had once been an orphanage. Over that year, I had many paranormal experiences, but most weren't scary. 2, however, were. To start though, I'll tell you about my first 2 nights there. The first night, I had come back after dinner with former coworkers. I had spent my day moving and with going out for dinner. I didn't have much time to unpack anything more than my bedding before calling it a night. That night, I had a dream that a boy between the ages of 10 and 12 came bounding through the front bedroom doors of my apartment and into the bed where I slept, as though he was saying hi. The bedroom door was right inside the apartment's front door, so from my bed, I could see out into the hallway where an adult male stood. I couldn't make out any features, just more of an impression of him. He stood back, arms crossed, watching. Weird dream, but just that, a dream. When I woke up next morning, both my doors were wide open. Maybe I didn't shut them all the way, I thought, even though I'd sworn I'd locked them. Maybe one of the girls was curious and snuck in. Except it happened again the next morning, and I know the doors were closed and locked. I wanted to set that up before I told the first scary incident. It's important because the floor was haunted by 3 ghosts, a preaching boy, a nun, and an evil male spirit. A fact I didn't learn until after I'd been there for more than a few weeks, and already had a handful of experiences under my belt. I've never been good at the whole sleeping thing, and at the time, falling asleep often took hours. When I did fall asleep, the slightest thing could wake me up. One night, I awoke with a start. It was like someone had put their hands right by my ears and clapped loudly. When I woke, I looked at the foot of my bed and saw a tall, dark shadow that blocked part of my door and the small sink and mirror to the left of the door. My bed backed up to a window, and the streetlight outside kept my room pretty well lit at night. It made the black shadow I saw seem ever deeper in comparison to other things I could see in the yellowy light. Of course, I didn't just see the shadow. I felt overwhelming hate radiating off it. Whatever it was didn't want me there. Problem was that I couldn't escape. I would have had to run right to it as it blocked the doorknob. So I did the only thing that I could think of that didn't involve escaping through it or jumping out my 3rd-story window. I threw the blankets over my head and repeated the Lord's Prayer until I fell asleep. I did see the shadow once more, in a situation similar to the first. The only difference is that I saw the shadow start to form. It started as a black ball that spiraled out, growing into a shadow person. I handled it as I did the first time, hiding and praying until I fell asleep. I am convinced these visits were the evil male spirit. The second terrifying thing happened on the 1st floor. My boss asked me to catalog what was in the 1st floor rooms that were not occupied. One of the RAs went with me, and together we walked from room to room making a list of what we found. Directly under my room was a laundry room. But unlike the one on my floor, this one contained a hallway that stretched back in an S shape and was lined from floor to ceiling with storage closets. As we walked deeper within the hallway, we grew quiet. Everything felt wrong. Like if we kept walking further, we would see something horrible or worse. We couldn't make it out alive, so we bailed. My boss would understand. Upon leaving the laundry room, there was one room left to check. I opened the door into what seemed like a monster storage area. A window on the far wall showed a few outlines of shapes. I remember seeing a bicycle wheel, but not much else. And the room was so dark, it also felt so much worse than the laundry room. And I couldn't bring myself to reach into the gloom and find a light switch. If I had a flashlight, I know I would have turned it off. The room radiated evil, and I knew that turning on the lights would illuminate whatever was the source of what I was feeling. So I slammed the door shut in a hurry. Here are a few other stories of what happened in the haunted dorm. The dorm I was in was a high school dormitory located in the high school. However, the school itself was operated by a four-year university located down the street. During my first week in the dorm, I had another head-scratcher of an experience occur. My first day of work, I went down to the university campus to meet others in my department, to make a campus tour and all the usual first-day activities. At 3, I headed back to my floor to welcome the girls home from school in an effort to start getting to know them. One by one, the girls walked in and headed towards their rooms. One by one, they returned, reporting that their bedroom doors were locked. I was the only person on the floor who had keys into their room. Not even the cleaning people had keys. And everyone, including the girls, would leave their doors unlocked unless they were inside their room. The girls hadn't locked their doors, and the cleaning staff hadn't locked their doors either. In fact, the cleaning people never entered the students' rooms unless they had private bathrooms, which only 2 of the girls, both seniors, did, and I sure hadn't locked the doors. The next day, the situation happened again. And yes, I thought it was strange at first that 2 incidences both happened 2 days in a row. The following Friday, I found myself as the only staff member on the floor, as my RAs had gone out for the evening. The hallway was L-shaped, and I was sitting right at the corner, telling some of the students about the weird things I had experienced. As I recounted what had happened, the door of an unoccupied room began shaking, as though someone were trapped inside and demanded to be let out. One of the students beside me screamed and scrambled into my lap as she tried to run away. I was scared as well. I began laughing nervously, and the student screamed at me, asking why I was laughing. Well, it was either laugh, run, or scream into the night, and I didn't have anywhere to run. As the semester went on and the students got to know me better, they all began to call me Mom. It was very common for them to come to my room, and I would keep my door open whenever I was up and around and call Mom to get my attention. After the students had gone to bed for the night, I would hear one of them call out Mom. Each time it was a different girl. When it happened, I would stick my head out, but no one would be there. Plus, with the building being nearly a century old, you could hear as someone went running away, or as their door opened or closed. And I never heard anything beyond the word Mom. In November, I began hearing flicking of metal blinds that hung in the living room. Each night, I'd hear ping, 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 until I fell asleep. One night, I had been asleep, but I had clearly grown tired of the sound, and I awoke screaming, "But the love of God, stop it." And I never heard the sound again. In December, one of the students was packing up her room as she was moving back to study in her native country of Mexico. She reported hearing a woman's voice softly praying in Spanish. It was our first visit from the nun, but she would become part of my life during the next semester. In the spring semester, all of the hauntings were benign. One of the seniors moved next door to me, and my side of the aisle was much quieter. When she moved, we both began to experience something new. At 12:30 a.m., I would hear one single knock on my door. 5 minutes later, the same thing would happen to her door. This occurred nightly for the remainder of the semester, and in each case, we would peek outside our rooms, but we wouldn't see anyone or anything. As summer neared, my life became more stressful. The job was taking a toll on me, and I worked 120 hours a week and only had 1 or 2 days off a month. The girls were preparing to leave for summer, but I was trying to figure out if I wanted to stay another year working in the dorms or if I wanted to return to school full-time. At the time, I was also preparing to have outpatient surgery to have something removed from my sciatic nerve. And 2 of my RAs didn't like that I would have to take a couple of days off right before the semester ended in order to recover. I was also nervous about the fact that I would be living alone in a haunted dorm for the summer. So I admit I was not in the best mental health, which may color how I perceive what I experienced. As the girls left, I found something strange started happening when I went to bed. At the time, I slept on my stomach like a starfish spread across the bed, and I would feel the covers flatten between my legs. Then the mattress would depress, as though someone had sat between my outstretched legs. Then a soft hand would touch my calf. I should have been terrified, but when the hand touched my leg, I only knew peace. With such a calm, warm feeling come over me. I wound up falling asleep quickly each night, and I'd like to think it was the nun helping me calm down from the stress I was experiencing in my personal and professional life. I haven't figured out who was responsible for all the hauntings. I think the doors being locked, the voices calling me Mom, and the knocks were all the boy. If I'd had to guess, I'd say the door rattling was him as well. It didn't seem malicious, just timed perfectly to scare the students and myself. My BFF once mentioned to me that her boyfriend could see and feel ghosts and spirits. He's kind of a one-upper, so I brushed it aside and never thought more of it. One Saturday night, we're all hanging out at my house, where I lived with my mother at the time. We weren't drinking, just hanging out and chatting. Suddenly, he went very still and silent. My BFF asked him what was wrong, and he said he felt a presence in the house, and it was very strong, and told us to keep chatting, like we were, and he was going to feel for it. My BFF and I returned to our gossiping. A while later, he speaks and mentions the spirit is in the kitchen, and it appears to be male, at least it does to him. He says it didn't feel like other spirits though, more like a good presence / guardian angel type. I still don't really believe him, so I start asking questions. He says the entity is definitely related to my family and that he is young. Then suddenly he turns to me and asks, "Did your mom have a miscarriage?" The blood drained from my face, and I get goosebumps everywhere. My mother miscarried a child before me. It would have been a boy, my older brother. There's no way he could have known about my mother, because my BFF had no idea either. Then he said, had she named him? He's trying to tell me it starts with an A. Started trembling. My mother had told me she had planned to call him Alex. He went on to explain how he believes it's my unborn older brother, and he's a guardian angel figure to my mother. He assumed he was there at the time to watch over her. It was unbelievably scary and accurate because at the time, my mother was going through a really bad bout of depression. I've never doubted his ability after that. When I told my mother about what happened the next day, she was sobbing and thought that she felt a presence by her side. She thought it was her grandfather, who she'd always been close to, not her unborn older son. And I still get chills to this day just thinking about it. This story is about seeing my sister. She passed away 7 years ago. First time I saw her started in a dream, where she was yelling at me to stop being a hermit and go out and meet people. When I asked her how, she said she didn't know, and to put an ad on Craigslist. That's how I met my husband. Second time I saw her, I was awake. I was walking out of my apartment complex to go pick up my son from school. And there she was, leaning against the building, waiting. She even walked with me to the school. My son ran up to where we were standing and started talking to my sister like he saw her often. On the walk home, my sister was walking between us, and this young kid tried to walk through what he saw was an empty space. He stopped cold freaking out before shooting around the side of my son and running away from us. I can't remember what we talked about, but it felt amazing to see and talk to her again. Last time I saw her was 8 months ago. I was at my parents' house and walked into my niece's room to talk to her and noticed her twin daughters, who were around 8 months old, jabbering away. I took a second look before I saw my sister sitting there in front of the babies talking to them. I commented, "Hey Jamie, do you understand what they're saying?" Not thinking. My niece freaked out and yelled at me before leaving the room. So I sat down behind the babies and we talked for about 20 minutes. My dad walked into the room and apparently catches a glimpse of my sister and kneels down crying, telling her he's so sorry. She tells me to tell him that it's all right, and that she still gets to talk and see her grandbabies, and that she loves you, Dad. I've got a few stories, but the one that stands out the most involves an old farmhouse that had partially burned down and never been demolished. The local urban legend was that the last family who had lived in it had died about 20 years before. The father killed his wife and his children, varies on the tale, then killed himself. Then the house caught fire, or he'd set the house on fire, depending on who tells the story. There was a standing dare spend the night in the house. Supposedly someone had and was sent to a mental hospital. Other kids tried, but got spooked or saw something. Just keeping an open mind, given my experience. There were 4 of us, kids aged between 12 and 14, who tried to spend a night in this old house. Our parents weren't thrilled with the idea, so we decided to walk to the house from a friend's house one night while sleeping over. His parents were sound sleepers, and he had his own door out of his house through the basement bedroom. To make a long story short, we got there, we lay down in a large room that still had some ceiling, although in retrospect this probably wasn't the best idea, but structurally we were fortunate. Then all 4 of us woke up at once, and for the same reason, near as we could tell, we'd all started to awake in response to someone screaming our names. One guy said it sounded like his mother. I thought mine sounded like my father. It was like a simultaneous nightmare. But given what we were up to, even that wasn't too inexplicable. The creepy part happened when we heard screams from upstairs. A woman's voice, shrill and panicked. It didn't sound like a scream from the movies. These were babbled words, and then some other garbled noises that didn't sound quite right. Then there was a loud thump, and then nothing for a few moments. Then we heard a gradual thudding sound, as though something were being dragged across rooms and was knocking against furniture and doorways. We stayed where we were, each of us listening intently, until we realized that we could hear this thudding sound at the top of the stairs, leading down into the room where it was at. Someone shone a flashlight at the highest point we could see. Nothing was visible. Then there was another thunk, like something had dropped a few inches onto a lower surface, like the next stair down. Within the beam of the flashlight, a flying insect took off, and so did we. I've told this story before, but exaggerated it, saying we heard sounds from where we should have been able to see something. The truth is, there could have been something upstairs, possibly with a stereo with haunting noises, but for some reason it doesn't make much sense. But it's more rational than ghosts. It still is the most terrifying moment of my young life, though. My parents and I were taking a tour at a house we were moving into. I remember when we walked past one of the rooms downstairs, and I got goosebumps when I looked into it. The lights weren't working at the time, so the realtor left it dark, making it even creepier for me. Fast forward a few months, and we moved into the house. I hadn't really thought about the room since then. One day, I was just kicking a ball around downstairs out of boredom, and at one point, I swear I could see something out of the corner of my eye. I looked towards it, and it actually stayed for a split second and then vanished. It looked like a little girl wearing a bright white nightgown, and it was standing right in the doorway of the room. It scared the crap out of me, so I ran upstairs to tell my parents. They laughed it off and told me I was spooking myself. A few weeks later, I was doing the same thing, kicking a ball around downstairs. Again, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. This time, I didn't look right away. I made an attempt to kind of glance at it, and making out just from my peripheral view. It was a tall, dark figure this time. Then I decided to look again, and it stayed for a split second and vanished. It was definitely tall, dark, and male, standing in the doorway of the room, and it was pointing inside of said room. Needless to say, I stopped kicking that ball around downstairs. Weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. When I came back, I tried to go to sleep and heard knocking on the wall. My room shared a wall with this spooky room, and it would knock a few times. Then I heard what sounded like a baby crying in that room. Then the knocking would start again, then repeat. It went on for a while, and I was too frozen with fear to investigate. I eventually fell asleep and had a dream about me walking past that room, and I saw a tall man hanging from a noose in the middle of the room, with the girl in white crying in the corner and a little boy running in circles around the man. Since then, I haven't had any other experiences with that room, and my family thinks I'm just trying to spook them when I tell them about it. I'm now living on my own and glad to be out of that house. My mom has always held the personal belief that there is some connection between what people call poltergeist activity and stressful, heavily emotional environments. Personally, I don't think this is any surprise, given her strained childhood and teenage years, most of which she spent living in the pub. Aside from the general delights of living above a pub in the 1970s, fights, IRA bombings all over central London, and heavy drinking culture, there are numerous types of activity that she experienced. There were 4 levels, a top attic area that was mostly used for storage, the first floor living area above the bar itself, the public bar and seating areas, and then finally a basement. Mom didn't like to acknowledge the activity at the time, which was fair enough since she had no choice but to live with it. On the living floor, things unfortunately weren't as active. But, as in the style with most old pubs, there was a staircase straight up from the bar into the apartment area. However, some nights, my gran would delight in sitting on the stairs quietly and listening to the voices coming up from the empty bar below. On that floor, Mom also told me that there were mirrors lining the hallway leading into the bathroom. She just says that at night, when she had to cross that hall, she would get a strange feeling and would never look into any reflections. The pub was bombed during the Blitz, which blew up the entire public bar and unfortunately, everyone in it. The floor had collapsed, taking everything and everyone with it into part of the basement. This was all rebuilt soon after, and as you might expect, the basement continued to be used for the storage of kegs and barrels. There was, however, one area that no one liked to go into, and that it was separate from the rest of the basement, and it was always a few degrees colder. The huge Doberman that my grandparents owned wouldn't go near the room and would actively resist being taken near it. Of course, this was the part of the basement where the bombing had hit. Finally, there was the attic floor, which I believe was fairly open and used mainly for the storage of furniture. This was above where my mother slept, and she said that countless times she would hear the unmistakable sound of tables being dragged across the floorboards. Probably most interestingly, when she met my father in her late teens, she still lived in the pub, and my dad was a policeman. When the noises would start up in the attic space, he would often go to investigate them, looking for intruders. He says that sometimes, in all earnest, he would go fully believing that someone was there, and he was about to apprehend a burglar, but he never found anyone. When I was 9, my dad started drinking heavily and turned to drugs. His addiction continued into my preteens and my teens. The house's energy changed and became dark. Doors started slamming shut, and you'd always hear someone pacing in the hallways. You would hear a phone ringing, but we didn't have a home phone. It was not a smart/flip phone ringtone. The scariest thing that happened in the house was that one night, I laid in my bed, and I felt my blanket slowly move down my body. So I tugged it back, and there was resistance on the other end. Then I heard someone crawling to my door. My mother's worst experience in the house was when she saw the figure. She woke up one morning, while I was ill, to go get something at a gas station. As she came out of her room, she saw someone walk down the stairs. She yelled my name and asked if I felt better. She followed until it disappeared around a corner. When she was at the gas station, she smelled something behind her and yelled for it to leave her alone. When my parents divorced, my mom and I were left to pack and move the house ourselves. The last day we were there, as we backed out at the driveway, we saw a figure in the window, waving. Turns out, there's a theory that if a teenage girl while going through puberty has a major emotional events that continuously happen, especially if it gets with her dad, her energy can peel off and create an entity. And whenever the bad flares up, the entity will feed off the energy. My best friend lost her significant other at a fairly young age. It was a shock to everyone and just horrible. They were very much in love and had a happy marriage. I temporarily moved in with her shortly after his passing. During the few months that I lived there, she often went out of town to visit family while on long-term leave from home. I would pet sit their animals when she was away, and they had 1 dog and 3 cats together. Their dog was like their child. My bedroom had 2 thin beds that were her significant other's childhood beds. Her dogs would sleep with me and my little dog in my bed, even though it was crowded. Now, several things happened that I knew were as a result of him letting us know he was there during the time. Some are so unbelievable, I don't dare share them. I don't need validation for what I experienced, but I think some may find comfort in this particular incident. I was asleep one night after working a double as a waitress, very tired. I woke up and saw a blinding white light in the shape of a ball over the other twin bed as their dog was just staring at. It was about the size of an exercise ball, but brighter towards the middle. I was terrified. I screamed the dog's name so loud it hurt my throat and squeezed my eyes shut. I hid under the covers and fell asleep. Some of these experiences I kept to myself because my friend was getting upset that these things were happening to me, not her. For whatever reason, he used me to tell her he was with her. She's since met someone else and gotten engaged. I've never felt anything again once I moved out of the house. She lives somewhere else now, and we don't talk about what happened during those few months that I lived there. This is my abuela's story. When she had her first son, my uncle, she would often either be home alone or have her mother come over for the day to help around the house. Well, one day, my abuela's telling me that she and her mother were sitting in the kitchen while my uncle was in his room napping in the crib. The way the kitchen is set up, they can see into the hallway and thus see my uncle's bedroom door is left ajar. She said that all of a sudden, this little human man darts out from under my uncle's room and disappears down the hallway. My abuela and her mother both freaked out and ran to check on my uncle, but he was sound asleep. She insists that it looked like a human man, just the size of a leprechaun or a goblin. She speculates it may have been a duende. I live in a dense part of town near what we call the town center. There are big well-lit streets, lots of businesses, lots of lights, a mall, a large hospital, a nice suburban area tucked behind it all. So it's not spooky to drive or even walk out at night. And I often take late-night drives to do grocery shopping at a place that's open almost 24/7. No lines, great deli as I'm driving. Like I mentioned, the area is well lit at night. I get a good look at her. Early 20s, long brown hair, wearing a kind of smart Burberry scarf and a tan sweater. Tight dark pants, brown boots, and I remember thinking she looked a bit too well dressed to be walking down that particular part of the city street at 11 p.m. But whatever. Maybe she drank too much at one of those mini restaurants or comedy clubs about 20 minutes away and decided to brave the walk home. I've done it myself. As I pass, she looks up right at me and we make eye contact. About 10 minutes later, I reach the grocery store in question. I walk up to the entrance and retrieve a basket. I notice someone exiting, so I move to the side to let them pass. I look up and it's the same woman. She glances at me and grins but keeps walking. I stood there dumbfounded as she rounds the corner out of sight. I took a few steps into the store, responded to the greeting of a passing worker without really having processed what they said, then decided to quickly walk back outside and see where she went. Despite the parking lot being very large and well lit and the only cars being mine and the other two that were there when I arrived, no one was there. It couldn't have been another woman that looked remarkably similar and had exactly the same clothes on. That's how I feel about it anyway. But it was a weird as hell experience nonetheless. This was about 10 years ago now. I lived in an apartment with my then 4-year-old daughter, just the two of us. Odd things would happen pretty frequently. I would clean the downstairs. I cleaned very thoroughly. Go upstairs and come back down and things like boxes of wine markers were on the counter. Light switches in my room would turn on and off. So much, in fact, I changed to a fluorescent tube light into a plug. Picture a shop light with a chain pull. They'd started doing the same thing, not the light flickering. The chain would be pulled. And in the winter, when the windows were all plastic sealed, my door would slowly open all the way as I watched. We had baseboard heat, and once I came downstairs after preheating the oven to the oven door being wide open. This was spring-loaded, and it wouldn't have just fallen open. Nor did I open it. Not all that into hauntings prior to this, but I just chalked it up to a non-threatening entity, because not too much happened I couldn't explain. This stuff would happen when it was just me in the house, without the kiddo, sober as a jaybird. One day, I tried to take pictures with a digital camera to see if I could capture anything. I take a few pics, nothing off. Then, as I turn towards the bathroom, half of the picture is jet black. Third, I face towards my bathroom fully, and the camera dies. Fully charged, and it takes a few elsewhere and it's working fine. Then I point it towards the toilet again. Camera dies. While we're there, my daughter had pretty frequent nightmares and kind of half woke up from them. She sleeps like a bear, so I didn't really think much of it. The night I took those pictures, she had a really bad one. After about 10 minutes of half sleep, I come to get her and she said her back hurts where the man scratched it. And she has full-length footed pajamas, which I removed to check, and she's got scratches on several parts of her back, places that would be incredibly difficult to reach, and nothing in her bed. She goes on to tell me that a tall man with hot hands put his hand on her back and told her to look at all the others, which she said there were lots of. We were out of there within a month. I've never felt more terrified and helpless. I was super poor at the time, but we spent a few weeks at my brother's until I found something else. To this day, when I brought my house, it was only out of sheer embarrassment that I didn't have a medium check the place first. We'd never had anything like that happen afterwards, but I swear up and down that it was more than just a contrived coincidence. I worked at the Cliff Hotel in Colorado as a housekeeper, and it was very haunted. Guests would complain about tapping sounds and feeling like they were being watched and had to move rooms every once in a while. The hotel was actually the second hotel built there. The first one burnt down in the 80s. The hotel was built on the base of Spike's Peak, and a lot of very famous, prominent people stayed there in the 1800s. At the time, the area was a very busy hub. There was a lot of paranormal stuff that happened to me directly, and also other staff as well. The first day I started, my boss Rosa told me that the last 2 housekeepers that worked the 6th floor had quit, and one right before me said she was pushed to the ground by a ghost and quit on the spot. Rosa also told me that I had to be strong with the ghosts, and I was working on the 6th floor, and that there was 1 housekeeper per floor and 6 floors. The 6th floor were all suites, and they were all really cool and luxurious. I loved being in the rooms and always felt different spirits, and they didn't scare or upset me. The one time I was freaked out, I felt a spirit was mad at me when I had the TV on, as I always listened to the radio or CDs guests would leave, and when I turned the TV off, it subsided. Another room always had the radio on when you entered. We would sweep the rooms at least twice to get any tips or gifts. The valet would try to sneak in and steal our tips the second sweep to just clean the room. The radio was on several times in the morning, and I would shut it off after I cleaned the room, and then it would be on again. This was the only room on my floor that would constantly be trashed by people. They'd smoke in there and leave messages not like in any other rooms. This story happened when I was working there for a few months. I went home and took a nap. Cleaning rooms is exhausting, and after I slowly opened my eyes, I saw the outline of the bottom half of a person. I slept on a futon mattress, so I was looking pretty close to the floor. I knew it wasn't human right away. You could see the little legs like they were hazy, and it clicked that it was an old man from the hotel. I could see him, but not see him at the same time. I was a little scared and probably purposefully didn't try to look at the face, but I said very sternly to go home, and he was gone. I've seen ghosts a couple of times, and it's usually on the edge of waking and sleeping. I think that's because the mind doesn't panic when drowsy, and you're more in a dreamscape when you normally wouldn't be so sensitive to something that is essentially air. I work at a nursing home. We would hear door slams in the back hallway. We would check the rooms, and everyone who could walk were in their beds, and given limited mobility of these people, there is no way they could have made it to their beds in time. All of our linen rooms and trash rooms were locked with a code, and every time we heard this mysterious door slamming, someone would be dead in 24 hours. There was also a time where we had this combative old woman with dementia. She would scratch and pull at the workers and just scream for hours on end. When she died, no one had opened the windows, and we heard her screams for 3 more weeks, and come to think of it, I don't know if there's a word for it, but some people seem to really be good at sensing when the end is coming. We had this one aide that looked at one of the patients. Vitals were fine. She was eating and everything looked okay. She wasn't even that old, maybe in the early 70s, and the aide comes and says, "You might want to come and see her before you leave. I don't think she'll be here tomorrow." I saw her and she looked fine. She was found dead at 8 a.m., an hour after we left. The aide later told me that sometimes she feels a strong urge to go into someone's room when she normally wouldn't, and that's when she finds them dead. One time when I was a kid, I was sleeping in my bed, but my dog Coda wanted out really bad. So I opened the door and left it cracked for when he wanted to come back in. I was laying there trying to fall back asleep, but I noticed the door had opened all the way now because the hall light was on and it was distracting. I assumed it was my dog coming back in, so I didn't think anything of it, but he was a big dog, so you can imagine that when a big dog jumps on a bed, it's pretty noticeable. But whatever got on my bed was super quiet and light, and I suddenly felt a cold chill. I was facing the wall and starting with a blank expression because I had no idea what was going on. I knew my dog wasn't in the room because I just knew. I always had my dog sleep with me. After I heard some quiet breathing, I decided to get up and leave. I didn't even look back. I just practically ran out of there into the opposite end of the house where my mom's room was. I knocked on her door and told her there was something in my room, and she pulled me inside and locked her door, and we proceeded to fall asleep about 30 minutes later. Later that day, after I woke up, I felt chills as I walked back down towards my bedroom. I was afraid that whatever it was still there. As I walked back to my room, I passed the living room and noticed that the front door was cracked open. That freaked me out even more. Whatever it was, it never happened again in that house. But I still think about that night and I try to understand what exactly happened and what it could have been. My parents' place is big, old, and haunted. Probably an overly dramatic start, but it is what it is. The sort of thing which have been reported there involved my brother seeing our deceased grandfather sitting on his grandfather's chair, my father having the blankets on his bed grabbed and vigorously shaken, my mother hearing what sounded like someone walking up and down the front porch and then going out, then snapping some pics, having some come out, a fogged up pillar shape. It could even be humanoid, but I'm not really sure. And I saw a figure one time in what I thought was another dog and felt the presence of others on a few other occasions. The story whereby I saw someone is that I was 10 and playing on the lawn with our new puppy when I look up to the back porch and saw a dude in a very nice tan/yellow suit standing in the front of what would have been a doorway back when the building served as a hotel, just standing there casually watching. I didn't recognize him. Looked down to our puppy, looked up again, and he wasn't there. Another time, about a decade later, I was just chilling in the lounge watching TV when I felt like my father had walked up and stopped to see what was going on. It was a large open plan room, so it wasn't uncommon for him to stop in the area just behind the seating, which is where we used to divide the area. I was just like, yeah, not much on, as I flicked through the channels for him, and after a moment there was no response. I looked around and was genuinely surprised to be alone in the room.